Good afternoon, everyone. We'll call to order this meeting of the Board of Commissioners Policy Meeting. We have on our agenda today three big policies that we're going to be talking about. Policy JJA, which is on student organizations, policy GCO, employee evaluations, and IHB, public charter schools. We have Chief Grant Skinner here for Chief Perkins Cohen for a bit. And Commissioner Richardson will be joining us as a voting member of the committee until Commissioners Lynn and McFadden get here, and then we will not be able to vote on anything because we have too big of a quorum. So just so that you know, it will be a discussion only amongst the board. So we will go ahead and begin with policy JJA. Good afternoon, Commissioner McFadden.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is James Torrance. I'm the Staff Specialist for Strategy and Compliance within the Office of the Academics. Today, we're presenting policy JJA, Student Organizations. This policy is providing a uniform policy and regulation for the coherent management of student organizations that are student-led in our buildings, as well as ensuring that there's equal access for those student-led organizations. And this comes out of the Equal Access Act, which mainly provides protections for students who want to meet for religious, political, philosophical purposes in our schools. In terms of definitions for this policy only affects non-instructional time. In terms of this, we define it differently for student-led organizations. We have another policy which is extracurricular activities. Those are typically school-sponsored. Student-led is just student-organized activities. And generally, we have restricted this to the secondary schools. That's why the definition of secondary schools is there, because that is where we see a lot of efficacy from our actual students in terms of organizing in their thought. And also, we see a lot of things beyond the school-sponsored activities, such as chess club. As well as
James, just to clarify, so this policy does not apply to elementary schools?
No, it's between.
So, because Roland Park, they have their GSL.
They have a secondary perspective. They have a secondary portion of the school, so it applies to their middle school, but then their elementary school.
So there are no clubs at elementary schools or organizations?
We have schools. We have extracurricular activities. Those are school sponsored. We're talking about student led, which is totally different.
Okay, perfect. Great clarification. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. In terms of student-led, we have a 5-factor test. That test means that it was informed and initiated by enrolled students at the actual school. It's student-sponsored and student-led, and it comprises strictly voluntary membership. We emphasize voluntary membership because we want to make sure that students have some efficacy at that level. And it must be available during non-curricular times and also not directly related to a body of coursework. That's where it differs from extracurricular activities. And school sponsored, as you can see, is authorized, supervised, or controlled by the CEO or a school designee or a school principal. In terms of it, we allow any group to form. They just have to submit their written list of objectives to the school principal and designee, and it has to be based off of those 5 factors. We do not discriminate upon viewpoint or discomfort of the viewpoint. We must provide equal access to all persons. In terms of operations, staff may be present, but they're not the actual advisor. They're there to assist if the students have any issues with facilities or if they need anything done otherwise for use of the school's facility. And has to be non-custodial staff to be explicit. Also, we know that organizations such as gospel choirs or anything that's related to religion, we want to make sure that staff can be there only as a supervisory capacity, make it explicit that we're not there to support the actual proselytizing, but we're there to support the use of the facilities.
So, James, a question related to that. Does that supervisory capacity only apply to religious groups?
It's all, but we had to spell it out explicitly for that because some of our school leaders had questions about that.
Okay, so then in the regulations, number 2, letter F, you might want to clarify that it's specific religious as well as other something, because I read that and I went, oh, but if it's a political thing, they can interject or.
Okay, 2F. In terms of meetings, the meetings have to be open to all students, no matter race, religion, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, genetic information, gender identity, or disability. And we also, because of other board policies, allow students to express their political views, as well as we know that these organizations, if they're collecting funds within our buildings, they have to be managed through the actual funding streams that we have in place for student activities. So the presence of board employees, again, we specify that they're there for purposes of supervision and actual observation. Because of the use of the facilities, as well as meetings will not interfere with the conduct of regular instruction. We put that there as an opportunity that if a school has an organization that is violating or disrupting the academic environment, we can either suspend or actually remove the organization. One of the things that came up from a meeting with students is that they want to know what's the appeals process. So at the student congresses, I believe their General Assembly on Thursday, I've agreed to come to actually discuss that with students so they understand what do they want as their rights for the student clubs and organizations, especially with an appeals. Also, the school principal reserves the right to actually deny outside individuals that are not students based off of ensuring that there's no disruption to the academic environment. In terms of this, we also specify that there can be no secret organizations and that it must be open to all students and must, again, be voluntary. And we also understand that staff cannot control these organizations. And that's it.
Commissioner McFadden?
Thank you, Mr. Torrance. Can a principal, what would be a reason for a principal to deny a student-led organization to exist in their school?
Emphasis. So that is a good question. So denial will have to be a clear disruption to the academic environment. So if you are not expressing your constitutional rights, we can't exclude you. But if you are destroying property, we can exclude you. If you are creating a hostile environment that is otherwise an expression of your viewpoint or there's any physical assault, we can excuse you. It's very broad, but it's also specific because we understand that disruptions to the academic environment impedes academic learning.
Is that in the regulation?
No, sir.
Would it be possible to include language similar to that in the regulation?
So examples of disruption?
Right. Or the reason why a principal would deny the organization. So maybe some examples, since you said it was broad but specific at the same time. I think that would help principals and students to kind of understand what would actually be a support to the school environment and community within the organization. And so also for them to know their rights as young people, right? Like what can we advocate for and what is not appropriate. I think that could be helpful in the regulation.
Okay.
Thank you. No.
So I understand the impetus behind keeping it as a secondary policy, but I'm wondering if that isn't just an artificial filter. So if there's 5th and 6th graders that want to join or start a club, so if this was more universal.
So to give you an idea, the federal law only refers to secondary schools. So
Okay.
we define secondary schools in our district as 6 through 12. So we're just being.
So this doesn't prohibit an elementary school group of kids from going to the principal and saying, we really want to do a chess club or a debate club.
It doesn't. It's just that we restricted it to secondary schools because of efficacy. And also the question is, in those outside of instructional time, how much supervision do elementary school students need? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the questions.
Okay. Speaking of instructional time, in the definitions, non-instructional feels like it needs to be tightened up. So that people specifically aren't saying, well, it's vocal music, so we'll just pull you from that or let you meet during that time. Or so specifically that it is outside of class times rather than non-instructional just something to think about. Under the policy standards, under letter B, under access, wondering if that should not also include that you need to have a permit or some sort of timeline for applying. Right now, what it says in the best of my memory is that principals need to approve using a space, but it doesn't say that as a student group you need to secure the space at least a week in advance or 2 weeks in advance. I could just see it becoming a situation where kids come up to a principal with this great idea, we're having this meeting this afternoon, and you have to decide. So some sort of a timeline and permit.
That's great feedback. I can
Procedure.
actually discuss that with the students on Thursday.
Also wondering, you did already go to the Student Congress, or are you doing that on Thursday?
Doing that on Thursday.
Okay, so also strongly suggest getting with some other organizations that are
We're
not as institutionalized as that.
So we're working with FCE to get in front of Algebra Project because they are a student-led organization, but they're also an external organization ran by our students. So we want to make sure that we cross the bases over the summer and contact these organizations because we know that we don't want someone to exclude any student groups, but we also want to make sure that there's fairness and access.
And then along with in the access category in the policy standards, consider adding a letter C or under letter C or anything that violates other policies protecting students or student liberties. Just to crosswalk it directly with the other policies we've been passing lately.
Okay.
And then one last question I had is under the regulations. One of our challenges that we see often in our audit findings is the oversight for activity funds at the building level. This might be a space where we could put in a periodic review or a periodic audit of activity funds or something to sort of systematize the activity fund project. I've talked to bankers with BB&T and PNC and M&T, and all of those three institutions specifically, but I'm guessing others, have a way to do a parent bank account and then individual school bank accounts so that we as a district could have oversight and then they get to manage on a daily basis. Just trying to make sure that we want to give kids as many opportunities to be invested as possible, but we also want to protect our principals from any sort of thing that might end up causing challenges. So, anything else? Commissioner Richardson, anything to add?
I don't have anything to add, but I want to echo the point that you just made about activity funds, because that is an area where we have been dinged as a district, and it would be nice to systematize the number of banks that our schools are able to use. I don't know if that goes in policy or not, but it's a great point.
Right. And then the last piece that I have is sometimes in the policy we're calling it student organizations, other times we're calling it student clubs, and just
Normalize.
to pick one for that. So, all right. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Moving on to policy G, CO, employee evaluations. Are you both our presenter and our CEO designee at this point, or do you have a team?
I have a couple team members here.
Excellent,
So Jesse
excellent.
Papia and Jerome Jones,
Excellent.
and I may join as well.
Hi, my name is Jessie Papia. I'm the Director of Employee Effectiveness for the Office of Human Capital.
I'm Jerome Jones, Director of Labor Relations in the Office of Human Capital.
So we are excited to discuss with the Board Committee our proposed policy GCO about employee evaluations. One thing I would note, just as we open the presentation, we think it's really important to highlight the importance and the role of employee evaluations when we think about the health of our staff. When we hear time and time again from our staff the importance of healthy, meaningful, supportive relationships with their colleagues and with their supervisor, and the feedback and the development opportunities that help them feel that they are high performing in their role and that they are cared about as a member of a school or an office community. We also know folks feel very intensely about employee evaluations. This is feedback on how they are doing and presenting as a professional. I often think about how I am in work more than I'm with my family or puppies. And so that feedback is felt very intensely, as it should be, by folks who are working very hard in our district. Okay. We want an evaluation system that feels meaningful and authentic for all of our employees, while still, we think both are possible, hold students at the center for everything that we do when we consider feedback and support for staff members. Okay. We hope that you'll see this reflected in the policy purpose and in the accompanying regulations. So our focus through this proposed policy and regulation is to clarify the purpose for and the expectations related to employee evaluations. This is not specifically tied to a particular series of components or weights or a particular rubric. Rather, this is meant to hold the process and expectations for all staff within our district. So you'll see in our regulations, we don't necessarily codify components and weights for a teacher evaluation, nor do we have attached the language for our principal leadership framework. This is meant to hold, again, the experience and clarify expectations and purpose for why we evaluate all of our staff. We are still, and I want to make sure to note this, in the midst of review with the Office of Legal Counsel for legal sufficiency. The drafts that we have shared reflect our response to the first round of feedback. And we look forward to continue to work with the Office of Legal Counsel. We also have engaged early on with various stakeholders. We wanted to hear from folks as we were drafting. We look forward to the opportunity for continued input as we go into the public comment stage. In terms of the intended outcomes, I mentioned before this opportunity and the importance of clarifying the purpose for employee evaluations, clarifying the board's definitions of what high-quality employee performance means and looks like across all roles, and also aligning the process for feedback, conferences, and observations of practice with our current context. Our proposed policies intend to clarify more uniform expectations for and the purpose of evaluation and how they are conducted. And we're very much interested in having procedure language that more accurately reflects our current context for evaluations for the Maryland College Career Readiness Standards. Just everything looks and feels very different than what it looked and felt like when PBS, or Performance-Based Evaluation System policy, was first communicated and rolled out. As I mentioned, this opportunity for clarity and that starting point of the PBS policy document, while PBS existed to add clarity around process and expectations, it was really directed toward our certificated staff members, in particular those affiliated with BTU. And so oftentimes for others of our employee groups, they were left with our website for guidance and communication around what to expect. We certainly worked hard to expand that, but we really think it's important to show the seriousness and the value which we take all employees being evaluated and receiving feedback. We also believe that it's important for some language and expectation to be elevated to the level of regulation rather than guidance alone when clarifying expectations and purpose. As we considered this, we really had three main principles that drove our work. One of them is the importance of accuracy and authenticity. We want to make sure that when folks are getting feedback, it is meaningful, it is accurate to what was seen, and it is authentically reflective of what someone is doing day to day and the type of feedback they need to grow in their role. It's really important for fairness, and I understand that fairness can look and feel like many things for different folks. When I think about fairness, I think about expectations and process are transparent, they are clear, there are no surprises. Our intent is not to create a gotcha kind of feeling, which is why we believe that having this clarified for all staff is incredibly important and fair. And also equity. We're thinking about the equity for each student. How do we make sure that feedback and talking about performance aligns to the impact and how we support our children, as well as equity for the adult experience as well? How do we make sure that we're differentiating process or feedback in a way that truly aligns with somebody's needs and strengths? To quickly touch on just some of the background and context, and again, what an opportunity this policy and regulation provide. Across all of our different employee groups, even within unions at times, we have very different language for describing performance. And so I think of a school leader who is supporting somebody across all of these roles. Except maybe unaffiliated, but across all of these roles. And they are trying to talk to their team about highly effective importance and what that looks like and feels like in our school community while we serve our children. They're talking about how it's safe to be developing in some areas and how we're going to grow and work together and develop performance. But they don't have one series of language to talk about that with their staff. And we've also, as a district, at least my team, has left them a bit adrift in that they have to create those meanings on their own, rather than hearing clarity from the board and from the district about what that looks and feels like across all roles. A little bit more context. When we think about timelines, and this is something that we were really exploring in discussions with various stakeholder groups. When I hear from the school's office, Jesse, can you give us some deadlines so we can help our school leaders prepare and calendar for the year? I'm like, can I give you deadlines? I could give you a whole page. And some of them are a week apart. So we're asking very busy folks to remember a range of deadlines, which are sometimes related to the very same type of milestone. But because things kind of grew up more grassroots from, I'd say, probably the employee level discussion, it is a little bit harder now for our school leaders and our supervisors. Something I'm excited about after my time in this role and on this team is the opportunity to really think back on some of the feedback we've received over the last several years. What you'll see here is a capture reflection of historical feedback we've received in the past. It has been ongoing. A couple of things I would just call out and draw attention to. A lot of this feedback is grounded in components, so very specific components of teacher evaluations in particular. And it was important to us that we were engaging stakeholders as we were transitioning from the PBS forms, the 3-tier rating system, more to our employee effectiveness framework as we moved with the state and really with the country as we were looking at different ways for teachers and principals to be evaluated. Some of the times that we spoke with folks, we were able to gather feedback, not just grounded in a component, but the experience overall. What was it like to be evaluated? How did that feel for folks? And suggestions for improvement. I would like to call out that there were common themes there, including the impact the evaluator has on an employee's experience with the evaluation. Folks would share, I see the intent in the design. It didn't feel that way for me, potentially. So we really need to think about training, ongoing communication. We also heard a lot about how feedback grounded in professional practice areas of an evaluation felt very important for folks, felt closer to their locus of control, and the feedback seemed more grounded in something that the next day they might be able to leverage or act on. And also, kind of going back to and echoing the first theme, but often we heard about the importance for training, for evaluators and observers, and then for employees on what to expect, what is the meaning of the rubric, trying to increase consistency across the board for folks' experience, and really thinking about the value of someone who has deep expertise in particular content or subject area, and the type of feedback they can give to an educator. Another key theme, maybe not expressly articulated by one focus group over these sessions, was that we saw through experience that we are often needing to hold and to balance a range of stakeholder feedback and what people have experienced with their evaluations or how that has felt for them. And so sometimes we are trying to balance and respond to even contradictory feedback, but wanting to understand how we best balance that with where we can go as a district and holding again our students at the center and the importance of feedback to help everybody grow in their role. This slide is meant to capture and reflect that the stakeholder engagement has been ongoing, and our intent here was to go early, both to our bargaining unit partners who serve as representatives for certain segments of our employee base, and also trying to broaden our outreach to a wider audience, and thinking about some key stakeholders who their insight, their perspective, and their relationship with schools could add some interesting complexity to some of the feedback around evaluations. As I mentioned before, this is part of our drafting process, so we're excited to be able to circle back with folks and get feedback on some of the proposed language and think about how close are we to hitting the mark with some of our stakeholder groups. What could this mean for either revisions or even just accompanying guidance that helps to further flesh out what some of this looks like for different groups. Slide 9 is just meant to encapsulate some of the questions that we brought across those stakeholder groups, asking folks about the purpose of evaluation, starting very high level. Why do we do this? Why do we ask folks to take the time to be evaluated, to evaluate others, to go through the feedback and reflection on that? Going into the defining of performance and what this means and what it can mean for folks across roles. And then thinking about how formal observations and what an unannounced formal observation could look like. This is a regulation that would be more specific to certificated folks who have that as part of their evaluation. But it's a broad enough and a very important employee base that felt critical that we discuss this. We were also asking folks questions about what might it look like if we had cycles for annual evaluations, differentiating some of that experience for our high performers. And then we got all the way into the nitty-gritties around aligning milestones and what could that look like to make sense of the calendar for the year. Something I was really excited about were folks' responses around why we evaluate staff. Whether we were with cabinet, whether we were with the union groups, whether we were hearing from folks in our survey, I was expecting that based on the range of experience from folks, it could be, evaluations are the thing used to terminate staff, and they are here to punish folks. It could be that the impact of an evaluation is limited to my pay. What I was really excited about is that consistently, the first things folks said back to us were in line with our values, our principles for why we even embarked upon this update to the policy and creation of the regulations. We heard from folks over and over again the importance to support, develop, and retain staff. We heard folks saying again and again, it comes back to our students' success and how we are each able to impact that. We heard often about the opportunity for alignment, and I'd say some important constructive feedback about how we need to be a little more thoughtful about that alignment with what's happening in evaluations and with our support and development structures, thinking about how this can help folks really find their career trajectory here with city schools. That's an important charge for us to consider. But I was excited to hear folks say this is what evaluations, this is why we would evaluate staff. A couple of the things in bold, just so you know, it was not just because I like blue, but just to, although true, but just to say again, some key phrases that were coming from some of the feedback forms that we received. And I think again and again, as we just again consider what we have called out for our policy around employee evaluations and the purpose for them, thinking again about that authentic assessment, and really even beyond the evaluation, which sometimes folks think of that end of the year conversation, but the cycle of improvement, ongoing engagement, folks shared that regular feedback, timely feedback was incredibly important, and we hope that that's reflected in the milestones that we're trying to carve out through the regulation for all staff. I think back to when I showed you many of the terms for how we could talk about a person's performance. And here we have in one of our regulations around annual evaluation, and acknowledging that we're not there yet where everybody has the same forms and the same terms. But where they exist, we think it is important to start to clarify that no matter your role, highly effective means something for our district, for our staff, and it means something for the children who are impacted by those professionals. So here we've called out proposed definitions where it exists in a 4-tier evaluation system, where we can now say what highly effective means, what effective means, developing, and ineffective. Two things I would call out that I thought were really powerful. One of them is around highly effective. I think about that way that we distinguish folks who are really standing out in the way that they perform, the way that they lead, and the impact that they have on our kids. That is something that we should be celebrating when we see that and acknowledging that for our high performers. Those are folks we don't want to lose, no matter their role in our district, unless, of course, it's that career trajectory and we're finding another high impact role. But thinking about how we acknowledge and distinguish those folks is incredibly important. I also jumped to developing because that is a rating that sometimes I think folks have a mixed reaction to. And I really think that it's because as a district, we haven't helped folks see that it is okay if in some cases you are still growing. And one of the things I actually loved about the feedback from our student body stakeholder group was when they were talking about how when you see that folks are working on things, when you see that folks are growing, that could be something that you would call out and that you would acknowledge. And that felt really important to the student body in particular when they were talking about the difference between ineffective and developing. And so you see that here, we said when there's evidence of growth, you are developing, you are growing in this area or this capacity. And the last piece I would highlight in the accompanying regulations, which you saw, there are, again, in our intent for transparency, when we think about having opportunities and milestones for ongoing feedback, you see that reflected in the regulations as we talk about initial planning conferences and IDP documents or individual development plans for staff to have goal-setting conversations, clarifying expectations at the start of a year. You also see that as we call out the importance of a mid-year performance review for staff to talk again about feedback for this formative discussion in the midst of the year. We try to call out with language the importance of data and talking about the evidence of impact, whether it's on school, student, or district success. We call out for formal observations, a process that we hope will increase the authenticity and accuracy of some of the feedback and the ratings that are derived from that component for our certificated staff members. And in particular, it's where we explore and would note that unannounced formal observations would be the way we'd implement those moving forward. We call out roles and responsibilities for supervisors, evaluators, qualified observers, and employees, including them in our definitions to try to clarify what each of these terms mean. And the other piece that I am excited about, at least from a stance of implementation, is having more language clarifying what it means and looks and feels like now that we have and have had for several years electronic evaluation systems and forms, and making sure that that's more clear in the regulations and talking about what that looks like in implementation. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if there's any questions.
Just one comment I can't resist. In terms of the use of electronic evaluation systems,
Yes.
and all I can think of is City Hall and ransomware, and may that not happen.
I think our team is pretty proud, Chief Perkins-Cohen, that we are not part of the attack, that we have fortified, that we should give our
Yes.
IT department a big shout
I think
out.
you should. I think Chief Bajula will tell you that he's very pleased with the team that we're not. But I'm knocking on wood because everybody's being attacked all the time, so you never know when you're next.
So I'll start with my comments while Commissioner Fadden gets his thoughts together. And I'm going to start at the end and work back. So under the definitions of the four-tier system, that was sort of your last big conversation, hoping that those then will be the four that are used across bargaining units, yes?
Yes.
And so then I would simply suggest, lean in to say, if each of the areas could give a vignette or description about what highly effective actually looks like for their folks to help support principals. And if we could do just a little flip book even. And going so far as to say that the science lead defines and helps say what quality science education should look like. The engineers, because I don't know if all principals know, is a building engineer evaluated by the cleanliness of the building or by their ability to do light maintenance or repairs or shovel snow promptly, and I think if we could just really clearly spell out for this is what effective looks like for this job description would be helpful. Flipping all the way back up to the beginning under the purpose then in the policy, the language that you've used is clearly intentional to not be punitive. The word evaluation in and of itself reads as punitive. So I'm wondering if there's not another bullet point that really is a summary of what you mentioned earlier about identifying career trajectories or supporting systemic leadership development from place, or another bullet around not expecting everyone to be perfect every day, but understanding that this is a continuous lifelong journey, something around growth mindset, just to be really clear that this is not setting out as a witch hunt experience. Under the policy Roman numeral level 5 compliance, when you do the annual report to the board, looking at not just accountability on how many people were at what level, but disaggregated by groups. So both, whether it's ASME or BTU, but also then within ethnic groups, within gender groups within those. So we get a tendency, are we overrating a certain group or underrating a certain group? And also then present those by either school level or geographic location. So are all of our highly effectives coming out of one school might help us identify further need for professional development on what evaluation is with principals, but also might be able to help Office of Human Capital more strategically deploy people where they're needed. You may, absolutely.
So just thinking about evaluation as maybe punitive, I'm not quite sure exactly what you said, but I think of evaluation as an opportunity to shine. Now, it doesn't always work that way, I understand. I mean, there's a gradation, but hopefully, hopefully that's what the evaluation process is. So just.
We all would like it to be that way until somebody's in your room watching, and then you start to.
But to that point, though, it's not always about career development, right? And so there are real moments when you do have to deal with some tougher issues that may not be a career path issue. It could just be,
Your
I
career
need you
path
to
is
come
real
on
estate.
time. Like
Your
I need,
career path is selling cars.
or that you need certain things that are like, I need you to here on time, right? Like ready to teach, like that sort of stuff. And so in that regard, I do like evaluation, but I mean, open for other words, but I think I don't want it to put all of the weight on this career path, which I think is important, don't get me wrong, but I want to set a realistic expectation about what is happening.
Yeah, and I wasn't suggesting getting rid of the word evaluation. I was just suggesting adding a bullet point to the list of purposes that makes it in short, because a lot of people hear evaluation and think of it as surveillance or, but yeah, absolutely. Because we need to make sure that the teachers or the staff and faculty that are invested in improving from wherever they are get the supports that they need. And those that are either not investing or for some reason have decided that they have reached their maximum capacity, and if it isn't where we want them to be, then they need to be counseled into real estate or something else.
So if it helps, as we have been in front of groups over the years, as we've talked about evaluation, typically when we open the discussion, we talk about that while it is an evaluation tool, we are here to talk about the performance management cycle, and that it is a complete cycle that we talk about setting goals initially. Where do you want to be as part of your IDP? You're setting your goals, doing the mid-year check-in to see where you are along that continuum, and then finally following up with a end-of-year assessment, which should then drive, okay, are there IDP goals that need to be set for next year, as well as if there are performance concerns, then let's talk about a performance improvement plan. So we try to talk about it in terms of cycles. So it's not I am saying you're this, but this is how I see you. This is how you're contributing to the students, the stakeholders, the mission of your particular organization. And these are the things that, and also encourage supervisors to highlight those things that you're doing really well, and that I would like you to take the lead in presenting those things that you have just excelled at, and be a mentor and a model for others. And people particularly like to be recognized. And that is a big reason that good organizations retain people because people are valued for what they bring each and every day. So we've tried to over time talk more about, while it is an evaluation tool, what we're driving here is a performance management cycle, and there are various tools within that toolbox that we should be using, and we should be discussing that it is continuing, and with the opportunity for all of us to improve and lead from where we are, and even if we want to designate there's another place that we want to be, talk about that at the beginning of the year as part of the individual development plan.
Makes a ton of sense. To that, and under the regulations, Roman numeral number 2 guidelines, it talks about the pre-conference and having and evaluating your goals, your annual goals. But there's no statement around, are they data-driven goals? Are they system-wide goals? Are they individually determined goals? If they're individually determined goals, are we going to use some sort of goal attainment scoring so we can compare apples and oranges? So that just felt like, to me, I would want a little more tighten on that as somebody who is going to be evaluated under this system.
Regulation.
It's under regulations, Roman number 2. Letter B, number 2. And I think that. And then the only other piece that I have is under the policy on Roman number 3, policy standards. There doesn't seem to be anything that differentiates for years of service or areas of expertise or content. And I don't know if that's, again, intentional to make this something that applies universally. If so, I think we do want to look at something like goal attainment scoring or something to help make some consistencies so that we can have some trend data we can look at system-wide about how effective the both tool and protocol are, as well as how people are doing at their jobs. Other comments?
Yeah, I have a few.
Okay.
Thank you. So I have a question about the SLO process. And is it a best practice to have one SLO? It's a question that I have. Throughout the course of, particularly for teachers, is it the best practice to only have one student learning objective? They're called that, right? Student learning objectives for the entire year. Is that a best practice? And to use that one SLO as a part of the evaluation for that year?
Yes, so for specifics to the SLO or the student learning objective, for both our teachers and principals, there's only one SLO in their evaluation. We balance that with the school performance measure to have multiple components and measures of student growth. I will say that most LEAs in the state that have SLOs, they have multiple SLOs. And so in terms of a best practice, I think, we had to weigh what the impact would be on just the implementation and the lift. If we were to increase the number of SLOs, I would say what we most often see are multiple student learning objectives in evaluations. Some of the things that we were considering wanting to balance, though, were would we be creating so much work around the creation of the SLO when we're interested in having folks monitoring their student data, reflecting on practice and how their students are moving toward attainment of that goal.
I get that. But at the same time, it's almost like we spend a lot of time focused on one particular goal when there are several goals that we should be meeting throughout the course of the year. So I understand what you're saying, but to that point also, why do we take into consideration the school performance measure in individual teacher evaluations?
Yes, and that is a question we receive often. So we have the school performance measure in both principal and teacher evaluations because we believe every educator and adult in the building is influencing the learning environment and the outcomes for children. The way that we do that may look different based on our role, but every educator in the building does impact that. Now, we don't think they are an individual teacher is the sole driver. It's why we have the weight at a smaller weight than other components within the evaluation. It is a balance of believing that there is some impact from everyone on the learning environment and on the outcomes for our kids, while also acknowledging that any individual in that building is not the only person impacting those same measures.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I'm going to give that some thought personally,
Yeah.
because I'm not sure how fair I think that is, and I'm sure you all have had that conversation with multiple stakeholder groups also. But thank you for that.
And thank you
the
for raising
assistant-
that.
Sure. The assistant principals in the 6th slide of your presentation, they don't have SOLs from what this looks like. I'm on slide 6.
Sorry, I also have horrible eyesight. Is this it? One more?
Employee group.
So I'm coming from
Yes.
the spirit
Yep.
of
Thank you.
the spirit of the blueprint and all of that. If the principals have the SOLO and the teachers have the SOLO, why don't the assistant principals have them?
That is an incredibly important question, and I am excited to be able to answer that, and it just so happens because of current work that we're in the midst of. So I would say, to start us off, teachers and principals, when we think about Race to the Top, there was initial push, legislation, funding available for work related to reviewing and looking at and updating those evaluations. We are currently working with Pizzazza. We've had a working group now for several months working on assistant principal evaluations. So we're in the midst of, and have just sent out to Pizzazza folks for feedback, an updated assistant principal and principal resident leadership framework, and are asking for their feedback on guidance for an assistant principal SLO. So they would also be shifting toward an evaluation that includes this effectiveness framework approach of looking at practice as well as impact. So in the future, they will have an SLO.
And then we perhaps may have to come back to the policy to revisit it, or is
So-
that's not specified in the policy, is it?
No, it's not. And that's the interesting, when you try to have everything, then sometimes it means you get nothing. Hopefully that is not the case. What we are trying to do with the policy and regulation is hold process, expectation, purpose without getting all the way into a specific component like an SLO. I am not saying that this is something we are even thinking about right now. But if there was to be surveys on assistant principals, for example, maybe a new component in the future that we believe, is evidence-based and gives real meaning to some of the feedback in an evaluation, my hope is that the language in the policy and regulations don't preclude us from exploring those components if they're meaningful, but that it still can encompass process and expectation for what rubrics or components are appropriate to each employee group. Those are great questions.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
And as we are developing more clearly what the assistant principalship looks like in Baltimore City, I just think it's important to keep these things on the forefront of our minds as we're trying to develop a very clear and strong pipeline to all types of leadership within our district. And I don't want the assistant principals to go unnoticed because things are not specified the way that they should for their role. It's kind of like this leadership framework, apparently, that the principals that support the principal evaluation. So you're saying that there is something similar being developed for the assistant principal?
Yes,
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
absolutely, thank you.
And I know we have to go to the next presentation. So the PIPs. So with the PIP, can a employee go to another school location or office if they are on a professional improvement plan? Do they have to stay in the school that they are in or the office that they're in? If they're put on the PIP, can they go to another school and still be on that PIP? Or is the PIP, can you help me, Mr. Jones?
Yes, I can. So that comes up very often. We do not disallow employees from transferring. Generally, we use the voluntary transfer affair in the spring for employees seeking to transfer for the next year. Being on a performance improvement plan does not preclude you from moving. being, having an ineffective rating, we would not allow you to move to another school. So a performance improvement plan does not stop you from moving to a new location through the voluntary transfer process. Because to do that, it feels punitive, and we don't want the performance improvement plan to be a punitive measure. It is something that we're fighting, and quite frankly, that is the perception throughout the district.
Which is why I asked.
Yeah, it is the perception throughout the district, and so we want people to understand that a performance improvement plan can be implemented just to address one issue. You can go on, you can come back off. You can have effective people on performance improvement plans because there is a couple of actions that you want to track, that you want to make sure that people do and support that. As a supervisor, I owe you this support in this area, so let's document it, let's track it, and then let's see how it turns out. So we are trying to move away from the perception that, and people saying, I'm going to pip you. It is not a verb.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it. And I also appreciate the language and the regulation that you all put for how the professional improvement plan should be monitored. I think that's very helpful. And hopefully we can just support more of what you just said in regards to the PIP and then the evaluation. And then finally, I want to just personally say that I do not believe in unannounced formal observations. I'm not sure if, and I know that you had feedback from different stakeholder groups. I completely am supportive of unannounced informal observations and those happening frequently. I think that the formal and I'm curious to know what the best practice is for other LEAs that are comparable to Baltimore City, not necessarily throughout the state, but how their formal observations are conducted with the spirit of retaining high quality teachers, instructional leaders, employees, period. I just don't think that it is fair to have unannounced formal observations, and from what it's in GCORD.
So we can get that.
I'm
the law-
curious.
Yeah.
And what is the reasoning, the thought process about doing formal observations unannounced?
Yeah. So, and I appreciate also the questions and the feedback. And I would say, because, I mean, it's important, it's what we're hearing from folks. I mean, there is anxiety from some of the stakeholder groups who we go to, and we're like, what could unannounced formal observations look like? And they say, whoa, unannounced formal observations, and there is a sense of concern, and I would say a fear of gotcha moments.
It seems punitive from like what we're saying and the conversation along that same spirit and line. A formal unannounced observation does seem like a gotcha moment.
Well, can
No,
I
I
ask a question? So is your problem that it's formal, or
Where are the
that
stakes?
because I feel like an unannounced observation will allow us to see kind of really what's going on. Now, perhaps it shouldn't be formal like in their file, but a pop-in
Those are
I think could be
informal,
helpful.
but those are
Those are-
informal
Those are-
observations.
Those are
They're
info-
not-
and they
You'd
do
rather
happen.
they be
Yeah.
informal.
No, there are observations that are specific to being informal, right? And then there are observations that are formal. The formal ones are attached to the evaluation. The informal observation should be to support the development of that. So yes, it could be unannounced, and I'm
Yeah.
getting a really clear picture of what's happening, but I can develop you or help coach perhaps for the announced formal observation so that we can kind of see some progress or grow.
Yeah.
There's a challenge within the regulations, because within the regulations, it states that you will have a pre-conference
Before the
before the formal. And to then do a surprise informal with a pre-conference seems like it would, well, unless, there's going to be a range.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And also, I will very much go back to to make sure I've checked my wording, the intent in the regulation is that the initial planning conference would need to happen before the first formal observation. The mid-year would need to happen before the second formal observation. Our focus and interest was on bolstering the experience of the post-observation conference, since that's where some of the reflection and the feedback are happening. One thing to say about the reason why to have explored and been interested in pursuing an unannounced formal observation, there is a space where COMAR, unannounced or announced, are equally allowable for formal observations. We've been looking at other LEAs. There are other LEAs, and when I think about comparable LEAs, I think about some of what Prince George's County is doing around their unannounced formal observations. And so we know that it is out there. I do think some of it is coming back to this idea and this interest in also having authentic reviews of performance. And it's really hard to give feedback and to say, oh, here are some things that I saw. If I was potentially helping you to play.
Right.
Right, or if I was even helping with the preparation for the lesson plan. And something I found very interesting and compelling in the value of the pre-observation conference was when folks shared, well, it's really important that my evaluator observer, knows a little bit of background on my students, a little bit of background on my class data, where we are in our curriculum. And that was why we call some of those pieces out as things to be discussed at the initial planning conference and at the mid-year conference, so that those topics are coming up. But we do want to see if we can get to a space where we're pretty certain that it's the formal observation results in an authentic review of performance as well. I do hear you, though, and we have to be really thoughtful about communication, messaging, and support so that it doesn't feel like it is only meant to be punitive. The only other thing I would add is that under PBS, when evaluators selected the end-of-year rating, proficient, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, included in the sources of evidence were informals, or those moments that were unscheduled. With our shift to the effectiveness framework evaluation, we've really codified kind of those data boxes for formal observations, and we have not made a space for some of those informal walkthroughs that used to be a really important source of evidence. So we are trying to find some balance with the regulation, but the concern that you have expressed is incredibly important, and I would say we've heard in other spaces.
And it's codified that any formal observation, the teacher has to be aware that it is an observation, and has to the observer has to provide written feedback. So it is not, I'm going to sit in your room and you don't know that I'm actually observing you. We have to notify, and the intent is to see what goes on day in and day out in a classroom, so that we can offer constructive feedback that actually gets into the overall tool, because there's, as Jesse said, there's no place in the tool to put the informal observations.
So I'd just like to reinforce what Commissioner McFadden is saying. I believe in the value of the informal and the formal as a whole comprehensive picture, however, not necessarily as a comprehensive evaluation piece. Certainly principals as instructional leaders should be in and out of classrooms regularly. I can see where a principal who is overstressed and overtaxed says, oh, I have 15 minutes right now, I'm gonna go do a formal observation. That in many ways could be setting up a teacher for failure, creating a culture of anxiety in the school. What might be a remedy to that, and I don't know, you live in the world, but if within the regulations there was if you get a highly effective rating during your formal observation, here's what you can expect to happen as follow-ups. You can expect to see some informal walkthroughs to determine, the accuracy of the highly effective. You can be expected to give professional development for your content or your building. You can be expected to, if it's engineers, to give a seminar on best practices of safety around food, whatever it is. But all the way through, so then if someone gets a developing rating, they know this is what I can expect as follow-up. And I could very easily see, highly effective and developing, expecting follow-up informal visits. Expect somebody to pop through and verify this. Effective and ineffective, maybe you're just sort of there and you can expect a formal and be finished. But I'm really challenged by unannounced formal as an initial, perhaps as a follow-up,
Interesting. Okay.
but not as an initial. But that's just me. So, other thoughts? All right, this is big stuff. We talk often about how the principal is the leader and the one that's going to determine what kind of success we have. But in reality, it's the person in front of every classroom. It's the person who's serving the food. It's the person who's greeting people at the door. And we all have to be on the same page. So this can go a long way to help if we do it well. If we don't do it well, it creates a witch hunt kind of ideology, and that's not going to help our kids or our employees. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, one more question, Ms. Please.
In slide 10, it's just a matter of wording where we've been going with, the policies. It says, the second sentence, the first sentence is committed to ensuring excellence and equity in education for each child at every level, right? And then it says the board requires all employees. Can we have uniformity in just saying each?
Yep.
That was it.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you.
Transitioning to policy IHB, public charter schools.
Good afternoon, everybody. Okay. So I'm Angela Alvarez. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of New Initiatives. So we're here to talk about the Charter Policy IHB and IHB-RA. Just as a reminder for members of the public, Baltimore City has most the charter schools in the state. Currently about 70% of charters, and we've been consistently opening and improving charters since we had charter law. And you see on the slide the last schools that have been open since 2010, which that number is about the same as the total number of charter schools that are in PG County. So we've been committed to partnering with operators, and we have not stopped in that commitment. City Schools Charter Policy, IHB, was last revised in 2011. Since then, the state law has changed. So a lot of our changes are to be consistent with changes in the law. So that's adding things like the geographic attendance area, priority statuses for military bases, preferences for schools that are sharing are owned by or operated by the same entity, and defining requirements for conversion schools. Additionally, there are other things that we wanted to consider when we opened the policy. That includes the terms for operators, putting some more clarity around standards around renewal, ensuring we have a stance on equity in the policy, and defining some of the sanctions that are listed in the policy but that were undefined, that are used in authorizing of schools. So I know we've done a policy committee, so it's not the first time. I don't feel like this is the first time you guys have seen this presentation or we've talked through it. So I don't know the best way, since this is kind of a second time we've done this in a public setting, because we had a forum on this policy in April. So I want to make sure I'm using you guys to the best, and so the policy and the reg are also out there to your ability or the best way to get feedback from you. So slide 5 is about the policy standards that are kind of upfront in the policy. One of the things we wanted language around was looking at what's here and thinking through if there's additional language we should be adding that gets at equity, both in terms of how schools are serving students, and potentially as well as in how we're authorizing entities that serve those students. So looking at equity in both of those places. Some of the basic, policy standards around the authorizing our operators is that we're looking for high quality schools. There's a high level of autonomy, and so there's a high accountability. So that's kind of like throughout each of the different standards that are here about the delivery on high quality, because partnering with operators are also part of our reform efforts. So you see that really highlighted too in the last bullet around accelerating gains. We're trying to improve quality for students through this work. So I'm going to
So, Angela,
pause.
Just a clarification on interpreting this slide. Slide 2 also has these same colors. Is there any relationship? Or it's just, you just didn't like just blue?
I just wanted to pop out
Okay. So
the
there's nothing
key
like the green,
statements
there's no coding to
in
it.
each of the in
Okay.
each of this, but it's not color coded. I just wanted
Okay, perfect. It was just because the
yeah.
things are color coded in slide 2, and I was like, does this align to these
Yeah.
colors? And
no, it was just to be able to be like, first standard is around providing high quality. Second one is around them being highly autonomous and highly accountable centers of innovation. They're like just to be able to, for members of the public and for us to be able to point
I
out
just
some
wanted to
key,
make sure I wasn't missing some.
key pieces. Sorry, I
interpretive
think I'm
connection.
rambling a bit. So I'm sorry.
No.
So I don't know if you have specific feedback on changes you would like to see in the policy standards.
I think we'll let you finish, and we'll go into that. I just really, it was literally about interpreting this slide
Okay.
in relation to slide 2, because the same blue, green, and purple were showing up in chunks, and I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't missing some through line.
Okay. Yep. So slide 6 is about the questions that I just kind of went through around how do we potentially reframe some of those policy standards so that they're focused both on equity within the schools and equity around how we authorize. And so I think I'm hearing from you, just keep going, and then at the end we'll talk about it. Okay. The other change that we're making, again, this is to be consistent with the law, so we're adding language around the geographic attendance area, defining, so the law says schools can apply to the board for up to 35%. So we just want to make sure that those pieces are in there, as well as schools can give greater weight to students who fit certain criteria, so being of a low economic group, being a student with disability, having limited English proficiency, or homeless student. So in their lotteries, they can apply to have weight for those populations. The law also allows for schools to apply to have preference if they operate 2 schools of different grade levels. So if I have a K-8 and a high school, being able to provide up to 35% preference to students who are coming from my lower school into my upper school. And then it also now clearly defines the requirements for converting a neighborhood school into a charter school. So for members of the public, so we have charter schools that are neighborhood conversion, so they still serve a zone, they continue to serve that zone. What the state requirements are making clear is that the schools who are eligible to convert into charter must maintain the zone, must also be of a lower poverty rate than the district mean, and that they must meet a strategic need for the district in applying to convert. And then the citywide seats are open to students in other zones on a lottery and space available basis. The other thing that we wanted to do in terms of this policy is look at the terms. So we've had, our first charter schools opened in 2005, but many of them actually existed prior to that. We had, before the charter law was passed in the state of Maryland, we had the New Schools Initiative. And so like KIPP, Midtown, City Springs. So some of our oldest charter schools were actually New School Initiative schools that were created in the 90s. So they've been around for a while. And many of those schools in particular consistently gotten 5-year renewals. So we're at a point in time where we want to be able to offer a longer term to schools who've demonstrated consistent success in terms of how often we review. So we're looking at adding an 8-year term to the possibilities for approval when a school goes through renewal for schools who've consistently had 3 or more 5-year renewals. Those schools, to get a 5-year renewal means you've been effective or highly effective in each of those major areas in order to get that type of renewal. The other thing we want the board, in recent times, we've had some schools where we've had conditional, and, we've had, last year we had a couple schools that had like a 1-year conditional. We would like to actually define a conditional, if we're going to give conditional terms to schools, for it to be for a 3-year period, so that we can look at a mix of data and practices. In a 1-year conditional, all we can look at is practices.
May I? Yeah, go ahead.
So I think these are all good ideas. I just throw out, because it occurred to me, if we do that, if a school does have a conditional renewal, then if you're considering offering 8 years to schools that have had 3 or more, never mind, I misread. My
Yeah,
bad.
so you're not eligible if you've had 3-year renewals? Yeah.
So Angela, as long as we paused, why 8? Why not 7 or 10 or?
So 8, so we looked at 5 years is actually the most common term nationally. So we looked at like what the terms are nationally. DC has longer terms. They give 10-year terms to schools. We consider that. But part of what we're thinking about is like the increments of time when we're looking at schools. And there's a lot of change that can happen in that time. So wanting to extend it, but not be so long of a time where a lot of changes happen and we haven't really looked at what's happening with outcomes in a way to be responsive. So it's sort of to be in the middle. It sort of flowed with our current terms, and we give a 3-year, and there's a 5-year. So it sort of flowed with that. So that was part of the thinking and concern around like 10 being a little bit too long. When you look at like the DC, like with our state tests have changed a lot. So when you look at that process, it's a bit complicated with all of those kinds of changes.
So your role is incredibly complicated as it is. So I certainly wouldn't want to make it harder. However, it feels like if we did 10 years every year we look at park data. If all of a sudden there's a change, or someone's falling in their state tests, or we see big gaps, is there a way, you have an 8-year renewal, but you might get an intervention that we need a report on your plan for progress or something, so we could do 10. I'm just trying to figure out how we minimize the amount of paperwork that is just for paperwork's sake, but we ensure that nothing falls through the hole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is, like, while we see park data, right, it wouldn't be enough for us to necessarily take an act. So one of the big tenets around being chartered is that there's autonomy. So we do hold schools accountable when they're not following policy. If there's major kind of concerns that are happening, they're not fulfilling their contract, they're not doing things like that. But slight deviations in their scores may not be enough to trigger, strong enough for us to be able to hold you accountable. But it may be in a renewal process, serious looking at it over a term. And so if you go a 10-year period, you're not going to look at it until, that 9th year of data. And so, a question, and what we've struggled with is making sure that we're giving longer terms to people who've been around for a while, but also looking at schools in a way where we can hold them accountable more frequently. So that's what we're trying to balance.
So to that point, the 3-year is the initial charter, right? If you are bringing a new,
No.
so that's not the initial. So when we grant an initial charter, can you explain that, if you understand what I'm asking?
Yes.
What I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, so the initial contract term for a school is 5 years.
Okay.
And so after that, in their renewal period, then as a
This
board,
is
you
with
consider.
what we're doing now to move forward. That's the way it already is.
Right now, the only terms that a school can get currently, so a brand new school always starts off with a 5 years. So if you approve them, they get a 5 years. in that 5th year, you review them and you determine whether or not they get another 5 years currently, or they get 3 years currently. That's correct. What we're proposing is for schools who have consistently gotten 5-year renewals, that they get a longer term.
So consistently could be the initial 5, it's in there? The initial, never mind, so if it's in there, but it could be the initial 5, and then another 5, and then, so it has to be at least 3 5 years?
That's what we have
Are
on the table.
proposing,
Yeah,
okay.
that's what we're
Well, I
proposing.
guess my question would be 3 consecutive 5 years. Does it say consecutive?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
And then this one I may have missed, but is there a maximum number of 3 years?
No.
So have we thought about?
So
if-
there's
if-
so this, it's funny, like when we're in this phase, I feel like the board and not just this board, like we've had this conversation for a number of years with different members of the board. So where we're in this part of the work, when renewal's done, there's always this question of we should limit, right, the number of 3 years. And the policy as it is today and as it stands, because it's not something you're changing, gives you the ability to consider the number of times that schools has gotten 3-year renewals. And you get that information, we discuss it as part of renewal, but it doesn't limit you to say, you only get this number of 3-year renewals, which I think is helpful to you as a board and to this broader school community, because schools are complicated places. So you've got to really consider it in the context of the data and the evidence about what's happening with the school. And so for some schools, that 3 years could be indicative of not being successful. And in those cases, you guys not renew those schools. In some cases, it's indicative of changes of happening. And when you see positive trends that show they're serving students well, those are the schools that you renew. And sometimes there's a challenge in the data that makes you want to look at them sooner, but it's not challenging enough where you don't believe they should exist today as a school. So you give them a 3-year. If you limit that, you limit your ability to do that. You then have to, you're limiting your ability to consider these other factors if you limit it. And when we're in the renewal phase, it's very challenging. The deciding to close an existing school is very challenging. Has a lot of impacts for students, for teachers, for the broader community. And you guys take that very seriously, which is correct. And so we caution us to have language that will lock you into something that in the face of an actual school may not make sense based on what that school is doing for that community.
I want to say so. As I understood the changes, though, 3 years are going to become conditional years, right? So
No.
if you-
No, what I'm saying is if the board believes that the school needs a conditional renewal,
only
the
if.
the minimum term would be for 3 years, rather than giving shorter than 3 years as a conditional.
So why would a school get a 3-year if they're renewed? They get a 3-year instead of a 5-year.
Yeah, because the data is mixed, so they have some data. Typically, schools that have gotten 3-year renewals have had a mix of developing and effective rating. So you see things in there that are good things that are happening for students, but there are things in there that are
Okay.
data points that you want to look at again because they're not as strong as they need to be.
That's right, and it doesn't necessarily warrant a conditional, so 3 years should not be viewed as conditional. 3 years was the original full term of the contract. So we've increased it over time as we've gotten more experience as an authorizer. So I don't think 3 years should be viewed as a punitive. There are many cases where a school's new and maybe it's still struggling, or there's just some data that's a little bit mixed, so you're not comfortable with a full 5-year, but you're comfortable with a 3-year. You don't need to set conditions on that, but you're comfortable with a 3-year. The other thing I would say about the multiple 3 years, I too generally like to give the board flexibility because these are complex decisions, and we also don't want to disincentivize schools who are trying to take on more challenging things. So if you're taking on conversions, that is really hard. And so we've really prioritized, we've communicated charters with, we want more conversions. Conversions are helpful. They're taking existing schools that haven't been serving students well and trying to make them provide better options for students. And so if they're willing to take that on, sometimes that does take longer because it is harder. And so I don't want to disincentivize that kind of work.
So this just totally is a professional development piece. If we do vote to approve the 8-year renewal, one of the nice things about the 3- and 5-year renewal is most board members then will see a charter come back for renewal during their term. We go to 8 years, and there's a really good possibility that an 8-year renewal vote will be the first time that board member has seen that charter. So there may be some pieces about professional development for the board around 8-year renewals. I just think about the number, the schools that came up this year for a second 3-year that we may have chosen to close, but that we saw the last 3, or I saw the last time that they came up, which provides a different level of insight into what's sort of happened longitudinally at the school.
I think that's right, and I think we would want to I think you're right, that we would want to make sure that there's professional learning for the board. I also just want to really emphasize that this would be the exception. We wouldn't be giving out a lot of 8-year renewals. 8 years is a long time. So this is a school who's really consistently, without any challenges, been providing a great option for students. And partly it's allowed the board and the staff to focus their time on schools where there is more going on, where you need to pay more attention. If we're routinely renewing schools that have just consistently not been a problem, it's not the best use of our time. At the same time, there's not very many schools where there's really almost no issues. It's a small number.
We wanted to make sure that the policy was cognizant of changes. So the board has been adopting policy. So in some parts it references rules that are now policies, as well as making sure that certain automatic waivers that are necessary to be a charter school are included in the automatic waiver section. Making sure, charters are not subject to policy JFB, which is about zones, with the exception of conversions. Charters are able to waive the procurement policy. They still have to follow state requirements around that, but that's a consistent thing. Same thing with school activity funds. They have to account for that in a different way than traditional schools. And then with the family and community engagement, the FC, the school family councils. So they have structures that are similar and provide similar functions. So we have to make sure that stays the same, but they're not named the same thing and they don't look exactly the same as in traditional schools and charters. This next section is on the policy allows us to give out sanctions to schools, but they're not. It's not defined in the policy. It's also not defined in the contract. So we wanted to put clear definitions around each of the sanctions that schools are subject to when there are accountability issues. And so they range from a notice of concern, and these are sanctions that schools receive for not fulfilling a requirement of the contract or not fulfilling a board policy that all schools must follow, like maybe it's a suspension. You had an illegal suspension, for example. You can get a notice of concern for that. Or like state laws and those kind of requirements. Depending on the severity of the infraction, you can get the kinds of sanctions, the titles of sanctions go up, and what you have to do to cure it increases. So a notice of concern, if you've got a notice of concern because you haven't submitted your budget, you cure it by turning in your budget, for example. So if it's fairly mundane things that are important that we hold schools accountable for, but are easily resolved, or notice of concern. It's more serious getting a notice of reprimand. So then that usually has more actions that are associated with curing it. It could be like if there's a consistent issue with like suspensions or documentation suspensions, making sure all your staff is trained in that. Looking at what's causing, so if it's a bullying issue, or you're following the bullying policy, the staff have training around social emotional wellness, that kind of thing. More serious is notice of probation and action plan, so that's like a much more severe kind of infraction. that has details. And then notice of revocation would be if we felt that the concerns were severe enough that we would, the CEO be recommending to the board ending the contract midterm. And those are things that are a serious threat to the health and safety of students, meaning academic needs of students.
So just a question on the user side on that, Angela. So I'm an operator,
Yes.
and I decide I no longer want to operate. Is there a form, like a timeline, due process for letting the district, how does that, so this very clearly articulates how the district communicates with the charter, that we're no longer interested in you chartering. What about the other way around?
So these are just this section is more about the sanctions that we provide. If a school wants to, so in the contract itself, if a school wants to terminate the contract, there's language around that. And so, we would want to know in the penultimate year if you're going to terminate your contract. So there's language around that in the contract itself. It's not necessarily as defined in the policy, but in the contract between us, it defines how you terminate an agreement. There's a process that we go through with that to make sure school community is whole and like here, this is just defining what a notice of revocation sanction looks like, but is in the policy further, it explains all the steps. So there's a period of cure, it kicks off like a legal process. So there's things that we have to communicate to the school, there's things the school has to do. It's also part of the contract too. That process is really defined. In the renewal section, it lists 4 categories for renewal because it separates out financial management and governance. We look at them as one category, so we've made the change in the policy to have it listed as 3 sections. It's just combining 2 of them. The policy organizationally, you can see the difference between non-renewal and revocation, but it's not as, it could be separated more clearly. So we've separated it even more just to make the differences between those, because there are different legal processes that guide those steps and different requirements for those steps. So we wanted to make sure that it was even more clear. They're currently separate, but we wanted to make it more obvious. And then also, this board, if a school has a not effective in any of the 3 categories, those are grounds for a non-renewal. That's been the how we've enacted the renewal process, and that's the standard the board has held schools to. So we wanted to just state that in the policy really clearly. In the remand, we still wanted kind of input on this. What we have in the policy is basically, so a remand happens when the board has decided to not renew or close a school. They appeal to the state board, and then the state board remands it back to this body. And so how we've done that is kind of how most legal processes follow, where it goes back to the last reviewing body to make a decision. The advisory board has asked us to consider going all the way back to the beginning. So the advisory board is advisory to the CEO, so they make recommendations to the CEO, and then the CEO considers those recommendations and then makes a recommendation to the board, and then the board decides. So the advisory board has asked us to consider in a remand, bringing it all the way back to them for it to go through that chain again, rather than it staying at the board level.
Right, yeah, and we do have some people for public testimony, so this
Yep.
this is really important, and it's a lot. If you can-
That's it.
I
We've
just wanted to
updated.
flag on that one piece. I think part of the concern about the remand is that the remand is remanded. The advisory board is that they are advisory. They are advisory to the CEO. The CEO generally takes their advice but does not have to. Makes a recommendation to the board. The board then makes the decision. What the state board is acting on is your decision. So the relationship, in my opinion, is between the state board and the board. And in fact, one of the remands that we had dealt with recently was a case where the CEO did not accept the advisory board's recommendation. So in that case in particular, it's clear to me it doesn't really make sense to go back to the entity who we already didn't take their advice. So, and it seems to me that, it's really a decision for the board. That's my personal opinion.
Yep. The last section is on the advisory board. So we did some work with the advisory board the last couple of years to more clearly define their role. So those are the changes you'll see in the reg related to the advisory board. They've also kind of renamed the body. These are members of the advisory board. We've also, in the section of advisory board, more clearly articulated standards around following the code of ethics. We wanted to make sure that was really clear for members of the public and how important that is, that there's an avoidance of conflict of interest and how the body operates, and have a clear statement about that within the policy. So that's everything.
Commissioner Richardson?
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. So if you could go back to slide 4 on the 5th bullet. The 5th bullet talks about ensuring the policy address the district's equity priorities and priorities for charter school development in Baltimore. Does this include our geographic priorities?
No, so we'll do that as part of looking at the application process, because that's going to change. So that's not something we would want to put in the policy itself.
Okay.
Because that's very changeable.
Right.
But that's something we would do with you around the application. So
When will we see the actual application before next school year? Like, I know that there are charters that responded to an application and have gone through a process this year. When will we see the one that is going to go live for next year?
Yeah, so I need to do some more talking with leadership and with Christian around how to get on and how to do that with you guys. But I'd like to do that late this summer, like in August.
Okay, I want to go on record that I do want to see it before it goes live. Okay?
The application for new charters.
That's right. Correct. And then on slide 8, the last bullet. So it talks about requirements around the different requirements that are listed there. One is free and reduced lunch. Should that be erased?
In the language we use in the policy, we said that's the language that comes from the state law.
Okay.
In the policy, we put economic disadvantage, and I think
Okay.
in paren. So we're referring to that so they understand it's how we look at that.
Okay, all right. Those were my questions.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Oh, I did have one question, but you know what? I'll email it to you offline because it's just a question on, there's a piece about religious organizations opening charters, and I wondered how that might impact our decision on New Song. But we can chat about that at another time. So thank you very much. Lots and lots of big levers being moved. So appreciate that. We do have 2 folks signed up to share with us some public comment tonight. As a reminder, public comment gets 3 minutes. We'll ask that you adhere to that. And then we go till 5:15. So if we need to circle through and allow people a second chance, we'll do that, but we have a hard stop at 5:15. So Jocelyn Providence, are you like to join us? No. Excellent. And be sure to push your little button so your light turns green.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jocelyn Providence. I'm a math teacher at Digital Harbor High School, recently elected secretary to the Baltimore Teachers Union.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So first I would like to point out, I know that there was a lot of, not a lot, but there were opportunities to provide feedback on this. I actually remember being a part of one of the meetings with Jessica Papia, and I think June 2017, starting this conversation, but I still think that there just hasn't been enough teacher input. There are so many teachers in this entire district, and for the past, I saw on one of the slides, it said for April, there was about 4 or 5 within the past 6 weeks, when April is one of the busiest times of year with testing for teachers. I think that there needs to be a lot more input given on this, in my opinion. And so one of the quotes that I have written down is that there's an attention to importance of data and evidence of impact on student, school, and or district success. So a lot of the feedback that I remember giving was the fact that we need to relook at the instructional framework first. Like, that needs to be the first step before we're adding on new things. I'm going to try to be quick because I know I'm being tired. Another thing, also, when we're thinking about another quote I wrote down was formal observation processes that increase authenticity and accuracy. This will not happen if there is not consistency in every school and across the vice principals and principals in the school. When I as a teacher in my past 5 years, every time having a different observer, having different feedback, having different information that's being stressed. One person stresses the objective more. One person stresses checks for understandings more. It's not consistent. And it becomes a punitive system. And I myself, and I know other teachers who feel like we're targeted for certain things when we possibly are speaking out against different policies going on in the school, empowering our students and our parents to speak out about different practices, feeling like already when someone is coming in giving you feedback that not only affects your pay, but like your personal evaluation. When I take a lot of pride in my evaluation, and when another principal or someone else looks at it and says, why do you have, I see all of these years before you have 4s and 3s, but now you're getting 1s and 2s. What has changed? Well, what's changed is that I feel a little bit more empowered to speak out about things that aren't good for students and staff members. And so that shouldn't be something that's reflected in my observation, especially for my professionalism. And so my last biggest point, I guess I'll say, and if I can speak more later, I'm definitely willing to. But so the idea of like, why would we add complexity into adding a formal unannounced observation to a system that's already not consistent? Depending on the school, depending on the students. I have, in one of my classes, I have about 36 ELL students. In another class, I have 17 general population students. For a principal or any observer to come in unannounced and think that sole formal observation should have that amount of weight is very inappropriate, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Providence. Our next speaker is Zachary Taylor.
Good afternoon. My name is Zach Taylor. I'm a middle school teacher at Commodore John Rogers, and as was stated earlier, BTU membership elected new executive board and new president this past week, of which I'm a part. One reason we won this election was because of our focus on improving teacher conditions in an effort to retain high-quality teachers. And we are greatly alarmed by the proposal for unannounced formal observations. As you all know, there are currently over 300 teacher vacancies in the city. We expect at least another 300 to depart at the end of the school year. Many LEAs currently don't even engage in annual formal observations practice for their tenured teachers, yet Baltimore City already has 2 formal observations, which with a much stricter instructional framework than in the surrounding counties. The anxiety surrounding formal observations is high even for the most experienced teachers. By intensifying the quality gap in teaching conditions between us and nearby districts, the policy of unannounced formal observations will drive successful teachers out of Baltimore City. By increasing vacancies and decreasing retention, this policy will hurt student achievement and it will lower staff morale. I also want to note that the slide that had details on the ongoing stakeholder engagement is misleading. While the BTU acknowledges that 4 meetings occurred regarding the evaluation process, at no point was it shared that unannounced formal observations were an expected outcome of this process. I myself was at the most recent date for the building representative meeting that occurred on April 23rd, and at no point was unannounced formal observations discussed in any sort of formal matter. The vast majority of the time was spent getting our ideas and thoughts about what formal observations have been like for us, and I can assure you we didn't mention our desire to have unannounced formal observations. This is not meaningful engagement with organized teacher leaders around this tremendous shift in evaluations. And I just want to briefly speak to the charter policy. It's disappointing and alarming to hear these presentations on charter policy revisions with no mention of the Maryland law that mandates that all employees of a public charter school are public school employees and that all charter school employees in Baltimore City must be employed by the board. Charter schools in Baltimore are prohibited from hiring individuals to perform bargaining work through foundations, nonprofit organizations, corporations, or any other entity. The BTU's legal counsel has requested this information. We know that over 140 of these individuals currently exist. The illegal employment of people engaging in BTU-covered work should be an aspect of how charters are evaluated and a focus of the board's attention. The BTU asks that the district develops policies to ensure compliance, holding that all employees of charters performing tasks that fall under the collective bargaining agreement become employees of the district so that they can access the rights and benefits they are entitled to under the law and under the district contract with the BTU. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll let you know, Mr. Taylor, that within the regulations, it does very clearly, explicitly say in the charter policy that they must be BTU.
I understand. The ask is that there's a framework to maintain compliance with that. As we know, there are 140, it might be 147, 143, I can't recall the exact number, currently in violation of this. And what steps has the board taken to employ these people so that we have legal compliance?
That's a really good point. Thank you very much. Commissioner McFadden had a couple of questions for Ms. Providence, and since we only have 4 minutes left, if you'd like, did you want to come back up for your second 3 minutes?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And we'll let Commissioner McFadden ask his question.
Okay. So I don't need the total amount of the 3 minutes. But one thing I did want to just point out that I thought it was a little ironic, the presenting of the policy with student clubs, because I know that thinking about myself and some other teachers who have felt like we've been targeted through formal observations, it has been through empowering students through clubs. So I think that's really interesting that they're both being presented on the same day. And then again, like similar to what my colleague was saying, was just the idea, the presentation of the feedback. Unannounced formal observations was never part of the presentation. A lot of the presentation that I know, like I said, I was a part of some of the conversations that happened about 2 years ago. One of the biggest things was, what are the types of framework and rubric that's used during these formal observations in other districts? And like looking into that and like looking into like, okay, like how can we improve the instructional framework and then have consistency? I remember being in a room with art teachers, with people who teach physical education, science teachers, and we were all thinking about, and I think Commissioner McFadden, you maybe were mentioning this, or Commissioner Hammond, the idea of like making sure that your evaluator also has a background knowledge of what they are looking at. Depending on what day you come into a classroom, you're going to see completely different lessons. I know as a math teacher, some days it's going to be a lot more exploratory, or maybe it's not as much checks for understanding because I want you to figure things out on your own. Versus another day when I'm doing a lot more like direct instruction and I need students to understand when I'm doing that. So I think that that's something that on an unannounced formal observation is not taken into account, especially with the current instructional framework, and especially knowing that I'll speak to my school for sure, that every observation by a different person is not the same. And so even going into different schools, I know some schools have filmed observations. That's also going to be very different if you're coming into a classroom unannounced with a filmed observation, or coming in unannounced with a tape tape recorder just listening to what the teacher is saying. So I'm very concerned about taking these big steps without actually going back to the drawing board of like, okay, how can we make sure that our teachers know exactly what is going to be looked at when they come in, and what is the expectations to be a highly effective teacher, to be an effective teacher, and then developing teacher also to make sure, like we said, giving that professional development. But just doing that unannounced formal observations is not going to create that growth mindset school that was mentioned that we really want to make sure that we retain our high quality teachers. Thank you.
Commissioner McFadden?
And I can stay up for questions if need be.
Thank you so much, and congratulations again
Thank you.
On your election. I often do this when we have staff present, and they're always present in our meetings. But how can we better engage, particularly teachers, in disseminating information and getting relevant feedback that gives us a better picture of all of the teachers that we have within our city and in our district? What would be some of those recommendations, if you have some? I know it's on the spot.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to know, how can we better engage, particularly our teachers, so that we get more relevant feedback?
Absolutely. Yeah, so one of my initial thoughts is go to where the teachers are. I know even when I heard about this school board policy meeting, I canceled a doctor's appointment to make sure I came here. I know that there's also people who have children, people who have engagements. Last week was my last week of tennis practice. If I still had tennis practice, I wouldn't be here. So there's a lot of different things that are pulling teachers in different directions, especially depending on where in the city that you teach. So I'm thinking going to professional developments, like where there's a mass group of teachers there, being there and asking for feedback. I know that's in all of our professional developments, we always are giving like feedback on the curriculum and different things going on. So I think going to where teachers are is one of the best ways to get that feedback initially right on the spot, is the first thing that comes to mind.
First thing, so PDs, where are some other places where they
Schools, and I mean, I think even just thinking about like different events that we know teachers would be in attendance of. I mean, also, I think that even reaching out to our newly elected BTU president, thinking about like, I know that there are building rep meetings every once in a while. Is it possible that we can come and present something so that we can get information? I promise that there are a lot of teachers who want to give feedback. It's just where and when it's happening is what the issue is, in my opinion.
I appreciate that.
Yep. Thank you.
So as long as you're there, and maybe
yes.
Zach has some ideas as well, and then we'll use our last 10 minutes to turn it over, see if anybody in the audience would like to join us for their 3 minutes. You're new members of the union. We're 4 board members here. Do you have any ideas on how we can work more lockstep together, or how we can be present together to show, to be, yes, collective bargaining, and yes, the machine, but we're really the same organization. We're the same organism. We have the same mission. So if you have anything off the top of your head, or else just let that sit there and know that we're interested.
Absolutely. We definitely see, as people who intend to be here for 30 plus years, and I'm in the first half. I've been teaching the city for 12 years. My first 5 years in the district, I had 4 different principals. I had 9 different assistant principals. A lot of schools are administratively chaotic, often with leaderless environments, except for the teachers. And teachers banding together is why I'm still teaching in the district. Yep. I see the need to improve teaching conditions as being the primary driver for retaining teachers. I work at one of the more successful schools in the city in terms of just organization. I work at Commodore John Rogers, and we have a lot of organized leadership, but every year we lose teachers because of the challenging circumstances we face. And to be frank, some of the things we hear about teachers sometimes is pretty disheartening in terms of like not just the national environment, but even locally. And that's something that I know we're interested as a board in improving, not just financially, although that is extremely important, but through the day in, day out conditions we face, often with administrations that make life really challenging for trying to do what's best for our students. That's not super specific. It would take a lot to get into those specifics.
I just mostly wanted to make sure that you knew that in a very public sphere, that we are not looking at, us and them, but we are really looking at, we are a city.
Absolutely.
And we are a city that has to come together on a whole lot of levels.
We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Sentiment.
All right, with that, we have 10 minutes remaining, so go ahead, go for it. Come on up. For the record, though, because you're not on record, be sure you name and
Okay.
all of that. And then we're not going to respond in
That's
case
fine.
there's others, just so that we can get, hopefully, 2 more in if we want.
Okay.
They won't.
I'm Kimberly Mooney, middle school Spanish teacher at Roland Park and newly elected teacher vice chair of Baltimore Teachers Union. So I want to say this first thing, and it's not to attack Ms. Papia, but it is to talk about the process. Several years ago, there were meetings that occurred over the summer, and teachers signed up out of their own time to come and give input about teacher evaluations. We were promised a lot of things at those meetings, that the notes would be typed up and sent back out to everyone who participated, that all sorts of things would happen with that, and none of that happened. And I realized that some of that is because of leadership change here. When Mr. McKesson came, there was a different attitude toward that data than his predecessor, and then since then. So a lot of change has happened, but there was a lot of teacher input that was never utilized and never made it to you. So we are showing up to give you that information. Take out the middleman would be my recommendation. And we're happy to distribute surveys, and we're happy to gather teacher input and get it to you directly. But really, it shouldn't be that it's filtered in any way. You need to know what it is that we're bringing to the table, because we are the ones that it affects the most. There was apparently a link posted during the Facebook Live, I guess just now, someone said, so they want to know how long that will be available for input about teacher evaluations. So that was a question that I didn't even know there was a survey until just now. Unannounced formal observations are gotchas. Having no pre-observation means that the last time that anyone was mandated to speak to us was the initial planning conference, and that could have been the first week of school before we knew anything about our kids. So that does not serve to substitute for a pre-observation conference. It also means that there's no focus. There's no way for us to say, hey, I'm having this problem. Can you come and see what you see and give me another set of eyes about this particular issue, or on this particular topic, I need help planning on how to address that curricular issue. I wanted to also say that the instructional framework, when it was first designed, was for reflection and growth, not for evaluation. So the fact that it's even being used as an evaluative tool is not what it was intended for. And it's almost impossible to hit all those T's in one lesson. And it wasn't intended to be that way. So that needs to be looked at. I think it's also being implied that teachers shouldn't be highly effective if their test scores are not on grade level, but a lot of us teach subject areas that are not tested, and furthermore, we are also meeting kids when they come to us not on grade level. So we should not be saying, oh, well, look at all these test scores, they're so low, how could we possibly have so many effective teachers if that doesn't line up? And I have a lot more to say, but my time's up, so I'm going to respect that.
Thank you, I very much appreciate that.
Welcome.
Do we have any other individuals that would like to be guests?
I'd like to speak.
Okay, so while we're transitioning, I'll just let you know that the reader process for the policies, it will be available at policy@bcps.k12.md.us for 60 days following this meeting for input. Before then, it gets revision. 60 days, isn't it, Allison? Yeah, and then it comes to the board for a first reader. So starting today, it kicks off that trigger.
Thank you. Let me try this again. My name is Fariha Wahid. I'm the lead special education teacher and the lead math teacher at Utah Marshburn Elementary. When I'm speaking on this topic, particularly informal evaluations, I'm really speaking from the lens of a classroom teacher, as well as the lens of a teacher that is supporting math content and curriculum across the district. I'm currently in grad school, and really what matters to me is research. Even despite decades of research and reform efforts, including the high-stakes accountability movement, American schools have remained ineffective in international comparisons of education with equally developed countries. When you're looking at how long it takes our students coming from low poverty to achieve the median socioeconomic status, it takes about 5 generations in America. When you're looking at more developed countries like Japan, it takes less than 5 years. It takes 2 years. So really, I'm thinking about what is Japan doing? What are other countries doing to develop their teachers that we can bring on top of what we're already doing? Currently in America, I know that adding additional accountability efforts to teachers is not working because really at this point, and today in 2019, most of my work is lesson plans and documentation, not actually thinking about what is it going to take for me to motivate that student. Can I go and actually do a home visit and meet that student's family and build that connection? And if you're looking back at the research, it does not support informal evaluations being a good thing. A lot of researchers like Dee and Jacob, in 2011, they actually suggest that accountability efforts on teachers have failed to alleviate the achievement gap. When you look at Mehta 2014, he suggests that accountability efforts actually lead to the professional deterioration of the teaching field. And when you look at Valley and Boise 2007, it says that accountability efforts actually have unintended negative consequences for students because you compromise teacher self-efficacy. I personally have a master's. There's teachers in my building who have 2 masters. We know what to do. We know what it's going to take to work with our students and get them to where we need to be. We are stacked against the odds. I work in a Title I school. Most schools in this district are low income. I mean, let's be real. Socioeconomic status is tied heavily to student achievement. I don't think that adding informal evaluations to teachers is going to have the intended outcome that you want. I think you have to look back at models like Japan, where they're using a cycle of improvement sciences. They're not adding informals that are unannounced and surprised or formals that are unannounced and surprised. They're looking at how are teachers planning for lessons. And in Japan, the teachers are coming together. All the first grade teachers are coming together, coming up with a lesson, going and teaching it, and coming back and giving each other feedback on how it went. That feedback is not coming from principals, and it's certainly not there as a punitive measure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Really appreciate all the input. As a reminder, we can be sort of flexible with the public comment at policy because we're just trying to get traction and we really want people to be here and to share. And so if we end up with more signed up public comment, then can go till 5:30, we'll keep going in the future. But to sign up, you can contact the board office beginning on the Thursday prior to the meeting. Either by phone or email, board@bcps.k12.md.us, so that you can join us formally. But as long as we have the space and the time, if you're here, I'll do my best to make sure that you can join us, because this is really, really valuable information. Our next meeting will be June 18th from 3:30 to, it says 5:15 to 5:30 on here. So I was like, I'm 3:30, 5:15-ish? And with public comment happening as soon as presentations are completed. We'll be talking about policy BDCA, long-range financial planning, and GLCE, telecommuting. So with that, 5:27 p.m., we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.